People are still arriving at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston to pay their respects to the late Senator Ted Kennedy. The library will host a memorial service tomorrow night. Senator Kennedy's funeral mass is scheduled for 10:30 Eastern Time on Saturday morning. He will be laid to rest at 5:30 p.m. on Saturday Eastern Time at Arlington National Cemetery alongside his brothers. On Capitol Hill, the tributes to Senator Kennedy from Democrats and Republicans have been undoubtedly heartfelt. That said, there is a notable theme emerging in the comments on Kennedy's passing from many Republicans. It's an insinuation, or in some cases an outright argument, that if Senator Kennedy were alive today to put out the right kind of bill, these Republicans might actually be voting for health reform.
Had Teddy been healthy and strong, the first thing he would have done was call me and say, let's get together and get this done.
Ted Kennedy has a long history of being involved in this issue in a variety of ways.
If he'd been his usual active self over the last few months, we probably would have reached some sort of a consensus agreement.
In other words, if only Ted Kennedy were still here, if only he had a health care bill, those Republicans say they'd voted for that. You know, Ted Kennedy did have a health care bill. Senator Kennedy was chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which approved a health care reform package in July. It's called the Kennedy Bill. Senator Kennedy helped write that bill. Senators Hatch and McCain and Gregg all voted against it. But the revisionist history goes even deeper. They aren't just saying they would have voted for a Kennedy health care bill, even though they had the chance and they didn't. They're saying they would have voted for a Kennedy health care bill because Ted Kennedy would have compromised with them, because Ted Kennedy was all about making concessions to Republicans.
I would hope that his example of working together and coming together in the spirit of compromise for the sake and good of the American people would have some effect.
And he always was willing to reach an agreement, if it was reasonable, to try to move things along.
We met for an hour about a couple of months ago, and he said, I'd really like to get this done. And, of course, I was prepared to try and put it together in a way that would really bring both sides together.
Apparently, in the history of Ted Kennedy's life and work, as imagined by the GOP today, Senator Kennedy was the great compromiser, ready to water down health care reform in order to bring Republicans on board. Of course, in the actual history of Ted Kennedy's life and work, he always said that and I say this without a hint of shyness, he was a doctrinaire liberal who spent the last 4 decades fighting to get health coverage for every American. And awash in this mainstream Republican revisionist history about Ted Kennedy, the great compromising moderate centrist, we're also facing warnings from the right now about how they intend to go after Senator Kennedy's memorial service this weekend. Conservative bloggers, led by those writing on National Review Online, are already predicting and criticizing what they're calling a politicized memorial service. Their message is, don't talk about Ted Kennedy as a liberal at his memorial service. And don't even think about making liberal sound like a good thing. Otherwise, conservatives will be upset. Joining us now is Democratic strategist Chris Kofinas. Chris, it's good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Rachel.
The service hasn't taken place yet, obviously. On the right, it is already being criticized for being political. What's your reaction to this?
Well, it's pretty shameful. I mean, it's hard to take rhetoric from, the right-wing fringe that have been championing some of the most vitriolic rhetoric against whether it's health care, let alone Senator Kennedy over the years. So it's kind of shameless that this is the kind of tack that they're taking to basically suggest that those are going to go up and eulogize Senator Kennedy and talk about the man, his career, his incredible accomplishments, that somehow they're going to be lectured by the right wing about what is appropriate. It's pretty shameless and I would say actually disgusting, but it is what it is.
Chris, we have seen only on the fringe of the fringe far-right attacks on Senator Kennedy so far, and I'm sure that they will start if they haven't started more in earnest soon. And I don't mean to say that those people who have attacked him already shouldn't be teased and made fun of for having done so, but it hasn't been a mainstream attack from Republicans at this point. That said, we are seeing a real reimagining of Ted Kennedy as if he was not a liberal, as if his real legacy was that he was sort of in between Democrats and Republicans somehow, as if he was a centrist. Do you think it's hard for the right to sit by while somebody who's is lauded as a liberal?
I think it's difficult. I mean, it is kind of interesting considering the fact that the right and the Republican mainstream attacked Senator Kennedy for decades and used fundraising or used him in commercials for their very own political ends. Now, I agree with you that the Republicans like Senator McCain and others have been kind in terms of their words, but in terms of how they're, I would say, revising Senator Kennedy's legacy and his record. I mean, was he bipartisan in the sense that he worked with Republicans on issues like education, immigration, healthcare at times? Absolutely. But I don't think anyone can actually argue that he was not an incredibly powerful liberal voice that woke up every day when he was a senator and fought for the very causes that he cared about in terms of improving poor people's lives, providing them healthcare, improving educational options. And in terms of this healthcare debate, this notion of somehow, that we could find a compromise, I've yet to hear any suggestion from any Republicans, including the three that were just mentioned, what that compromise would be. Tell us. The Democrats would like to know. The reality is their compromise is no health care reform.
Chris, we have seen something like this before in liberal politics. The right went on the attack for the funeral of the great Senator Paul Wellstone. They attacked that as being a celebration and a rededication to his political goals and to his political mores. Is there residual resentment, do you think, among liberals and Democrats for having been attacked for the way that they mourned Senator Wellstone? Could this end up being a really big fight?
I think there's some, residual resentment in the fact that it was pretty distasteful when that happened. In terms of Senator Kennedy, I think it's going to be a very respectful affair, but I have no doubt that they're going to, and appropriately so, talk about his incredible accomplishments. They defined him as a public servant. Here's a man who spent nearly 5 decades fighting for the issues that I and so many Americans care about. The notion that you shouldn't talk about that, the notion that you shouldn't talk about healthcare and these other issues, I actually think would be inappropriate. I think they're going to do a great service to a great public servant.
Democratic strategist Chris Kofinas, thanks very much for joining us tonight, Chris.
Thanks, Rachel.